Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with words that seem impossible to keep. Sometimes a woman's broken heart finds healing in the arms of a man who sees her not as damaged, but as destined. In 1887 Wyoming, Jed Brannigan stood 6'8", with the kind of strength that came from splitting logs and wrestling cattle. His new bride Eliza had buried one husband and believed her dreams of children died with him. But on their wedding day, Jed took her hands and made a promise that would echo through 13 winters. "You'll give me 10 sons." It wasn't a demand, it was devotion. What started as an impossible vow became a legacy written in love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds of family. But could one woman's heart truly carry such a burden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory in the winter of 1887 was a place where dreams either froze solid or burned bright enough to melt the snow. Eliza Brannigan, she still stumbled over that new surname, stood at the frost-etched window of what was now her cabin, watching her husband of 3 hours split wood in the fading afternoon light. Each swing of his axe sent echoes rolling across the valley like distant cannon fire, and each piece of split pine tumbled to the growing pile with the satisfaction of work that would keep them warm through the long nights ahead. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, her wedding ring catching the last rays of sun filtering through the heavy clouds. The simple silver band had belonged to Jed's mother. He'd told her that morning when he'd slipped it onto her finger in the tiny chapel that served Bitter Creek's faithful. It was worn smooth by decades of frontier life, and somehow that felt right. Nothing about this marriage was new or untested. It was built on the foundation of two people who understood that love wasn't always about butterflies and stolen kisses. Sometimes it was about choosing to stand together when the wind tried to knock you down. The homestead deed lay spread across their kitchen table, the official seal of the territorial government marking their claim to these 160 acres of rolling hills, pine forests, and grazing land. Jed had shown it to her that morning after the ceremony, his calloused finger tracing the boundaries that would contain their life together. Here's where we'll build something that lasts," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty that seemed to come as naturally to him as breathing. Eliza had nodded, though her heart had hammered with something that might have been fear or might have been hope. She wasn't sure she knew the difference anymore. At 27, she'd already buried one husband, and with him, the dreams of the children they'd never had. Thomas had been a good man, gentle and kind, but lung fever had taken him their second winter together, leaving her with nothing but memories and the cold knowledge that some dreams weren't meant to be. The townspeople of Bitter Creek had whispered about her remarriage with the particular enthusiasm reserved for other people's business. She'd heard fragments of their conversations as she'd walked to the chapel that morning, her dark blue dress, her only good dress, rustling against her wool stockings. Poor thing, marrying again so soon. Wonder if she'll be able to give Jed what he wants. That Brannigan boy's got big dreams for such hard country. What they didn't understand, what she was only beginning to understand herself, was that Jed Brannigan didn't see her as a woman marked by loss. When he looked at her with those steady grey eyes, she saw something she'd almost forgotten existed possibility. The sound of boot steps on the porch pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned as the door opened, bringing with it a rush of cold air and the scent of pine and snow. Jed filled the doorway, like he filled most spaces, not just with his considerable height and broad shoulders, but with a presence that seemed to steady the very air around him. His dark hair was damp with sweat despite the cold, and his breath formed small clouds as he stomped his boots clean. "Getting colder out there," he said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "Storms coming in from the north. We'll be snowed in proper by morning." Eliza nodded, moving to the stove where she'd kept coffee warming. "I made supper. Nothing fancy, salt, pork and beans, biscuits from this morning." "Smells like heaven," Jed said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even though she wasn't looking at him, though I suppose anything would after a day like today. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups, acutely aware of how domestic the moment felt, how right it seemed, despite everything that should have made it feel strange. "It was a nice ceremony," she said, handing him the steaming cup. "Pastor Reynolds spoke well." "He did." Jed wrapped his large hands around the cup, and she noticed again how gentle those hands could be despite their obvious strength. "Martha Wilson came up to me after. Said she'd be by tomorrow to check on you. Make sure you're settling in all right." Martha Wilson had been the closest thing to a mother Eliza had known since her own past, when she was 16. The older woman served as midwife to half the territory, and her presence in Eliza's life felt like a blessing she hadn't dared to hope for. "That's kind of her," Eliza said, settling into the chair across from him at their small table. The homestead deed crinkled slightly under her elbow, and she smoothed it carefully. "This is really ours?" "Every acre," Jed confirmed. "Filed the claim myself 3 years ago. Been building it up piece by piece. The cabin, the barn, the corral, all of it's solid. Built to last." Built to last. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, and Eliza found herself studying her husband's face in the lamplight. Jed Brannigan wasn't what anyone would call handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too strong, too weathered by wind and sun. But there was something in the set of his jaw and the directness of his gaze that spoke of reliability, of a man who meant what he said and said what he meant. "Tell me about the vow," she said quietly, surprised by her own boldness. "What you said this morning, about the 13 winters and the 10 suns. Did you mean it?" Jed set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his eyes never leaving her face. "Eliza, I've never said anything I didn't mean. That vow wasn't made lightly." "But 10 sons," she shook her head, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I couldn't give Thomas even 1 child. What makes you think—" "Because," Jed interrupted gently, "you're not the same woman you were then, and I'm not Thomas." The simple statement hung between them, carrying implications that made Eliza's heart race. She'd married Jed Brannigan knowing it was a practical arrangement, a widow in need of security, a bachelor in need of a wife. But sitting across from him, in the warm glow of their first evening together, she began to understand that nothing about this man was purely practical. "The land can support it," Jed continued, gesturing toward the deed. "Good grazing, plenty of water, timber for building, and the territory's growing. There'll be opportunities for strong young men who know the country." "You've thought this through," Eliza observed. "I've thought about little else since I decided to ask you to marry me," Jed admitted. "Not just the sons, but the life we'll build, the legacy we'll leave." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling past the glass. Inside their cabin, warm and secure, Eliza felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and fear she'd carried since Thomas's death. "It scares me," she said honestly. "The idea of trying again, of hoping for something so big." Jed reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His palm was warm and calloused, solid and reassuring. "Then we'll be scared together," he said, "but we'll try anyway." The next morning brought the promised storm, and with it, a sort of enforced intimacy that might have been awkward between 2 people who barely knew each other. But Jed moved through the morning routine of feeding the animals and checking the roof for leaks with the easy competence of a man comfortable in his own skin, and Eliza found herself settling into the rhythm of their shared space more easily than she'd expected. Doc Henley arrived just after noon, his horse struggling through the deepening snow. The old physician had delivered half the babies in the territory and buried a good portion of their grandparents, and his presence in their home felt like an official blessing on their union. "Wanted to check on the newlyweds," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Make sure you're both settling in." "We're managing fine, Doc," Jed said, taking the old man's coat. "Coffee's hot, and Eliza made cornbread this morning. Doc Henley's shrewd eyes took in the domestic scene, the neat cabin, the way Jed and Eliza moved around each other with consideration, if not familiarity. The homestead deed still spread on the table. "Building something here, are you?" "Planning to," Jed confirmed. "This land's good for raising cattle, growing hay, and raising children." "Ah." Doc Henley accepted a cup of coffee from Eliza with a grateful nod. "Heard about that vow you made. 10 sons in 13 winters. That's ambitious, even for Wyoming." Eliza felt her cheeks burn, but Jed's expression remained steady. "Nothing wrong with having goals, Doc. Nothing at all," the old physician agreed. "Just want to make sure you both understand what you're taking on. Childbearing's hard work even under the best circumstances. Out here, with the nearest real hospital 200 miles away, well, it's not something to approach lightly." "We understand the risks," Eliza said quietly. "I've already lost." She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "She's stronger than she knows," Jed said firmly, "and she won't be doing this alone." Doc Henley studied them both for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good. That's what I wanted to hear. Martha Wilson's the best midwife in the territory, and I'll be keeping an eye on things as well. You'll have all the help you need." As the storm raged outside, the three of them spent the afternoon talking about practical matters, the best time of year for births, the supplies they'd need to stock, the importance of good nutrition during pregnancy. It should have been embarrassing, discussing such intimate matters with a man she'd known less than a day, but Jed's matter-of-fact approach to the subject made it feel like planning any other aspect of their life together. By evening, Doc Henley had stayed for supper and regaled them with stories of other frontier families who'd built dynasties in the harsh Wyoming territory. "The Cartwrights up north," he said, gesturing with his fork. "They've got 7 boys now, and every one of them strong as an ox. Started with nothing but determination and a good woman willing to take a chance." "What made the difference?" Eliza asked, genuinely curious. "Partnership," Doc Henley said without hesitation. "The couples that make it out here are the ones who understand they're building something together, not just a family, but a future." After the doctor left, promising to check on them again once the weather cleared, Jed and Eliza sat by the fire, the cabin quiet except for the crackling of burning logs and the whistle of wind around the eaves. "Do you really believe we can do this?" Eliza asked, watching the flames dance behind the grate. 10 sons? Jed was quiet for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "I believe we can try," he said finally, "and I believe that trying with you will be the greatest adventure of my life." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was vulnerability there, carefully hidden but present nonetheless. Jed Brannigan, for all his size and strength and certainty, was taking as much of a leap of faith as she was. "Then we try," she said simply. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside their cabin, 2 people who had started the day as near strangers began the slow work of becoming a family. It would take 13 winters and more challenges than either of them could imagine, but on that first night, with the homestead deed spread between them like a map of their future, they made the first small step toward an impossible dream. 6 months had passed since that storm-bound first night, and spring had transformed the Wyoming landscape from a world of white silence into rolling hills of green dotted with wildflowers. Eliza stood at the same kitchen window where she'd watched Jed split wood on their wedding day, but now her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, and her heart carried a mixture of joy and terror that left her breathless. The first baby shoes lay in her lap, tiny blue booties that Martha Wilson had knitted and brought by just that morning. They were impossibly small, crafted from the softest wool Martha could find, and they represented everything Eliza had dared to hope for and everything she feared to lose. "You're carrying well," Martha had said, her experienced hands gentle as she examined Eliza. "Strong heartbeat, good position. This baby wants to be born." But wanting to be born and surviving the harsh realities of frontier life were two different things, and Eliza couldn't forget the small grave behind the church in town where she'd buried her dreams once before. Thomas had never even known about that first pregnancy. She'd lost the baby so early that she'd barely had time to hope before the hoping was over. The sound of approaching hooves drew her attention to the window, and she saw Jed riding hard across the pasture, his face grim with concern. He'd been checking the cattle in the north pasture, but something had clearly gone wrong. She watched him dismount and stride toward the cabin with the purposeful urgency that meant trouble. "Eliza," he called as he pushed through the door, his hat still in his hands. "Pack what you need. We're riding to town." "What's happened?" She struggled to rise from her chair, the baby making her movements awkward. "Found tracks up north, wolves, and a big pack by the looks of it. They've been testing our fences, looking for weak spots." Jed moved to their bedroom and emerged with his rifle and a box of cartridges. "Doc Henley needs to see you anyway, and I want you somewhere safe while I deal with this." Eliza's hand instinctively moved to protect her belly. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough." Jed's jaw was set in the hard line she'd learned meant he was worrying about more than he was saying. "Lost 2 calves already, and there's sign they're getting bolder, coming closer to the buildings." The ride to town was uncomfortable despite Jed's careful handling of the wagon, and by the time they reached Doc Henley's office, Eliza was fighting waves of nausea that had nothing to do with the baby and everything to do with fear. The doctor's examination was thorough but gentle, and his verdict brought both relief and new concerns. "Baby's strong and healthy," he confirmed, wiping his hands clean, "but you're carrying tension in ways that aren't good for either of you. This worry about wolves, it's understandable, but stress like this can cause problems." "What kind of problems?" Jed asked, his voice tight. "Early labor, for one, and we're not ready for that yet. You're only 6 months along." Doc Henley fixed them both with a stern look. "Eliza needs rest and peace of mind. That baby needs time to grow." "She'll have both," Jed promised, "whatever it takes." But providing peace of mind proved easier promised than delivered. They spent 2 nights in town at the boarding house, while Jed organized a hunting party to track the wolf pack. Eliza lay awake, listening to the men's voices in the saloon below, their plans growing more elaborate and dangerous with each round of drinks. "Biggest pack anyone's seen in years," she heard Tom McCready saying. "At least a dozen, maybe more. And they're not running from men like they used to." "Means they're hungry," added Bill Foster, whose ranch bordered theirs to the east. "Desperate hungry, which makes them dangerous." Eliza pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements that seemed to echo her own anxiety. The tiny blue booties sat on the table beside the bed, a tangible reminder of how much they had to lose. The hunting party rode out at dawn on the 3rd day, leaving Eliza in Martha Wilson's capable care. But by afternoon, word came back that sent ice through her veins. The wolves had doubled back and attacked the Brannigan homestead in broad daylight, killing 3 more cattle and destroying part of the chicken coop before disappearing into the timber. "They're not just hunting," Martha said grimly, reading the message that young Billy Patterson had brought from the ranch. "They're sending a message, claiming territory." That night, Eliza woke to sharp pains in her lower back and a dampness between her legs that made her cry out in terror. Martha was at her side instantly, her face grave as she assessed the situation. "It's not labor," she said firmly, though her hands were gentle as she helped Eliza change into a clean nightgown. "But it's a warning. Your body's telling you that something needs to change. The baby." "The baby's fine for now," Martha interrupted. "But if this stress continues, if these early contractions get worse, we could have real problems." When Jed returned the next morning, empty-handed and frustrated by the wolves' cunning, he found Eliza pale and shaken, clutching the blue booties like a talisman. The sight of her fear-stricken face transformed his frustration into something harder and more determined. "We're going home," he said simply. "All of us." "Jed, the wolves." "I'll handle the wolves." His voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "But I won't have my wife and child living in fear. That's not the life I promised you." The ride home was careful and slow, with Martha accompanying them to monitor Eliza's condition. The homestead looked different, somehow smaller and more vulnerable against the vast expanse of territory that surrounded it. But Jed moved through the evening chores with methodical efficiency, checking and double-checking every fence line, every lock, every possible entry point. "Tell me about the baby," he said that evening as they sat by the fire. It was the first quiet moment they'd had since the crisis began, and Eliza could see the exhaustion in his eyes. She placed his hand on her belly, and they both felt the strong kick that followed. "Dr. Henley says it's a boy," she said softly. "Strong and healthy, just like you promised." "The first of 10, Jed said, but there was something different in his voice now, not the easy confidence of their wedding day, but a harder, more tested certainty. "And he'll be born safe, in his own home, surrounded by family." "You can't promise that," Eliza whispered, "not with everything that's happening." Jed was quiet for a long moment, his hand still resting on her belly where their son moved and grew. "Maybe I can't promise safety," he said finally, "but I can promise that I'll fight for it every single day. For you, for him, for all the children we'll have." Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, and Eliza felt the baby respond with a sharp kick. But instead of fear, she felt something else, a fierce protectiveness that seemed to flow between her and Jed like a current of electricity. "Then we fight," she said simply. The next morning brought fresh wolf tracks circling the cabin, and Eliza understood that their peaceful beginning was over. The blue booties, once a symbol of hope, now represented something more complex, the courage required to bring new life into a world that offered no guarantees. As she packed them carefully in the chest, where she kept her most precious possessions, Eliza felt her son move strongly within her, as if he, too, understood that their family's story would be written not just in love and joy, but in the kind of determination that could face down wolves and worse. The inciting incident wasn't just the wolves themselves, it was the recognition that the vow Jed had made on their wedding day would require not just love and hope, but the willingness to defend what they were building against forces that would try to destroy it. Their first child would be born not into the peaceful homestead they'd imagined, but into a family forged by adversity and strengthened by the knowledge that some things were worth any risk to protect. Samuel Jedediah Brannigan entered the world on a night when the wind howled like banshees and snow piled against the cabin windows in drifts that reached the sills. His first cry pierced the air with the strength of a future rancher, and the carved cradle that waited for him had been hewn from Wyoming pine by his father's own hands during the long evenings, when the wolf threat had kept them close to home. Jed had worked on that cradle with the focused intensity he brought to everything that mattered, each piece fitted and sanded smooth as silk. The headboard bore a simple carving of the Brannigan Ranch brand, a circle with a star inside, and the rockers were shaped to provide the gentle motion that would soothe a baby through the long frontier nights. Martha Wilson had arrived 2 hours before Samuel's birth, summoned by Jed's desperate ride through the blizzard to her cabin 5 miles away. She'd taken one look at Eliza's condition and rolled up her sleeves with the competence of a woman who'd delivered more babies than she could count. "This one's in a hurry," she announced, washing her hands in the basin Jed had prepared. "Strong contractions, good position. He'll be here before dawn." Jed paced the cabin's main room like a caged bear, starting every time Eliza cried out, his hands clenching and unclenching as if he could somehow share her pain through sheer force of will. The wolves had been quiet for weeks, driven deeper into the mountains by the harsh weather, but he'd positioned his rifle near the door just in case. "First babies usually take their time," Martha called from the bedroom, "but this little one seems to have his father's sense of urgency." When Samuel finally arrived, just as the first grey light of dawn touched the windows, his lusty wails filled the cabin with the sound of triumph. Jed was beside the bed in 2 strides, his weathered face transformed by wonder as he looked down at his son. 10 fingers, 10 toes and lungs like a bull calf, Martha announced, wrapping the baby in the soft blankets she'd brought. A fine start to your dynasty, Jed Brannigan. Eliza's exhaustion fell away as Martha placed Samuel in her arms. He was red and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair that stuck up in all directions and tiny fists that grasped at everything within reach. When she offered him her finger, his grip was surprisingly strong for something so small. "Hello, Samuel," she whispered, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "We've been waiting for you." Jed's large hand was gentle as he touched his son's cheek. 9 more to go, he said softly, but there was no pressure in his voice, only joy at the miracle they'd created together. The first weeks of Samuel's life were a blur of feedings and diaper changes, and the particular exhaustion that comes with caring for a newborn in a frontier cabin. Eliza learned to function on fragments of sleep, her body recovering from childbirth while adapting to the demands of motherhood. But she also discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You're a natural," Martha observed during one of her regular visits. She'd taken to checking on them twice a week, bringing supplies and advice in equal measure. "Some women struggle with the transition, but you've taken to it like you were born for it." Maybe she had been. Eliza found herself humming lullabies she didn't remember learning as she rocked Samuel in the cradle Jed had made. The simple melodies seemed to calm both baby and mother, creating a peaceful cocoon in the midst of the harsh Wyoming winter. Jed threw himself into the role of father with the same wholehearted dedication he brought to ranching. He could change diapers with surprising skill for such large hands, and he'd taken to walking the floor with Samuel during the colicky evening hours, his deep voice rumbling through songs and stories that seemed to fascinate his tiny son. "He likes the sound of your voice," Eliza observed one evening, watching as Jed's humming settled Samuel into sleep. "Just telling him about the ranch," Jed replied, carefully placing the sleeping baby in his cradle. "The cattle and the horses, the way the grass looks when the wind blows across it, he should know about his inheritance." Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Samuel grew stronger and more alert, his dark eyes tracking movement and his smiles becoming more frequent. Doc Henley pronounced him healthy and robust during his monthly visits, and the old physician seemed particularly pleased with how well Eliza had recovered. "You're built for this," he told her bluntly. "Some women struggle with childbearing, but your body seems designed for it. That's good news, considering your husband's ambitious plans." The mention of future children filled Eliza with a complex mixture of anticipation and trepidation. She'd discovered that she loved being a mother, loved the way Samuel fit perfectly in her arms and the way his face lit up when she entered his line of sight. But the memory of those terrifying early contractions during the wolf crisis still haunted her quiet moments. As if sensing her thoughts, Jed appeared beside her with a cup of coffee and settled into the chair beside Samuel's cradle. "Penny, for your thoughts," he said, his grey eyes studying her face with the attention he usually reserved for reading weather patterns. "Just thinking about the future," she admitted, "about what we're building here. Having doubts." Eliza shook her head slowly. "Not doubts exactly, just awareness of how much we're taking on." Jed reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "We don't have to do it all at once," he said gently. "One baby at a time, one season at a time. We've got 13 winters to fulfill that vow." The practical aspects of frontier parenting became clearer as Samuel grew. Eliza learned to time his feedings around the ranch work that couldn't wait, and Jed adapted his schedule to be available during the fussiest parts of the day. They worked as a team in ways that surprised them both, their partnership deepening through shared responsibility. The neighboring McCready family visited when Samuel was 3 months old, bringing their own brood of children ranging from toddler to teenager. Watching the controlled chaos of a large frontier family gave Eliza her first real glimpse of what their future might hold. "Gets easier as they get older," Sarah McCready assured her, bouncing her youngest on her hip while keeping an eye on the others. "The older ones help with the younger ones, and they learn responsibility early. Nothing like ranch work to build character." Tom McCready nodded his agreement. "My oldest boy's been doing a man's work since he turned 14. It's good for them, learning what real work looks like." As summer progressed, Samuel began showing signs of the sturdy independence that seemed to be a Brannigan family trait. He slept through the night by 4 months, freeing Eliza from the constant exhaustion that had marked his early weeks. He was fascinated by the sounds of ranch life, the lowing of cattle, the neighing of horses, and most of all, the sound of his father's voice, calling instructions to the hired hands. "He's going to be a rancher," Jed observed one afternoon as they watched Samuel's intent focus on the activities outside his window. "Look how he tracks every movement, like he's studying how it all works." "He's got time to decide what he wants to be," Eliza said, but privately she agreed. Even at 6 months old, Samuel showed signs of his father's steady attention and his mother's determination. The first anniversary of their wedding approached with Samuel, sitting up on his own and showing the first signs of mobility that would soon have him crawling all over the cabin. Eliza marked the date by taking out the blue booties Martha had knitted, now far too small for Samuel's chubby feet, and packing them carefully in the chest, where she kept mementos of their growing family. 1 down, 9 to go. But as she watched Jed teaching Samuel to clap his hands and listened to her son's delighted giggles, Eliza realized that the counting had become less important than the living. Each day brought small miracles and large responsibilities, and she was beginning to understand that their dynasty would be built not just in the number of children they had, but in the love and strength they put into raising each one. The carved cradle sat ready for its next occupant, and Eliza had already begun feeling the familiar signs that told her Samuel would not remain an only child for long. But for now, she was content to focus on the miracle they'd already been given, a strong, healthy son who carried his father's determination and his mother's capacity for love. Outside, the Wyoming landscape rolled away in all directions, vast and challenging and full of possibility. Inside their cabin, 3 people had become a family, and the first chapter of an impossible vow had been written in sleepless nights and unconditional love. The family Bible sat open on the kitchen table, its leather binding worn smooth by generations of hands, its pages yellow with age and reverence. Eliza dipped her pen in the inkwell and carefully inscribed the second entry in what she'd begun thinking of as their sacred record. Jacob Thomas Brannigan, born October 15th, 1889, 7 pounds 4 ounces, healthy and strong. 18 months had passed since Samuel's birth, and their second son had arrived with less drama but no less joy than his older brother. Where Samuel had announced himself to the world with lusty wails, Jacob had entered more quietly, studying his surroundings with serious dark eyes before deciding that this new world might be worth staying in. The 2 boys could hardly have been more different. Samuel, now walking with the determined gait of a toddler who had places to go and things to explore, possessed his father's intensity and single-minded focus. He would spend entire afternoons studying the movements of the cattle, his small face grave with concentration as he watched the hired hands work. Jacob, still small enough to fit comfortably in the crook of Eliza's arm, seemed to observe everything with a philosopher's patience. He rarely cried without good reason, but when he did need something, his protests were impossible to ignore. Even at 3 months old, there was something about his steady gaze that suggested depths beyond his years. 2 sons, Jed said one evening as they sat by the fire, Samuel playing with wooden blocks at their feet while Jacob slept peacefully in his mother's arms. 8 more to go. But the counting had become less mechanical and more hopeful. Each birth had strengthened Eliza's confidence in her body's ability to carry and deliver healthy children, and each day of raising Samuel and Jacob taught them both new things about the kind of parents they wanted to be. The homestead had expanded along with their family. A new barn rose, where the old one had stood, twice as large, and built to withstand anything Wyoming weather could throw at it. Additional corrals handled their growing herd of cattle, and the hired hands now included 2 full-time cowboys who helped Jed manage the increasingly complex operation. "You're building an empire," Doc Henley observed during one of his visits, watching Samuel toddle after the barn cats with the persistence of a born rancher. 10 years from now, this place won't look anything like it does today. "That's the idea," Jed replied. "Every son will need his place in the operation. Samuel can handle the cattle. Jacob might be better suited to the business side of things. By the time they're grown, there'll be work enough for all of them." Eliza listened to these plans with a mixture of pride and amazement. The shy widow who had married Jed Brannigan was transforming into the matriarch of a frontier dynasty. Though the change had happened so gradually, she hardly noticed it herself. She could manage the household while keeping track of 2 active children, coordinate with Martha Wilson on medical matters, and even handle the ranch's bookkeeping when Jed was busy with the cattle. "You've grown into this life," Martha observed one afternoon as they watched Samuel attempt to teach Jacob the finer points of stacking blocks. "When I first met you, you were so uncertain, so afraid of taking up space. Now look at you running a household, raising boys who'll grow up to be men of substance." The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. The winter when Jacob was born had been particularly harsh, with snow that lasted well into April and temperatures that froze the water barrels solid for weeks at a time. Caring for a newborn and an active toddler while dealing with the isolation of frontier life had tested Eliza's endurance in ways she hadn't expected. But they'd managed, drawing strength from each other and from the growing certainty that they were building something that would outlast any single season or challenge. The family Bible became their anchor, its daily readings providing structure and comfort to their evenings, its record of births and milestones creating a tangible connection to the future they were creating. Samuel's vocabulary expanded daily, and his first clear words beyond mama and papa were cow and horse, much to Jed's delight. He followed his father everywhere his sturdy legs could carry him, absorbing lessons about ranch work with the seriousness of a much older child. "He's got the instincts for it," Jed said proudly as they watched Samuel carefully approach a gentle mare in the corral. "Look how he reads her body language, how he moves slow and steady. Can't teach that kind of awareness, it's born in him." Jacob, meanwhile, seemed more fascinated by the mechanics of how things worked. Even as a baby, he would study the movement of clock gears or the way shadows changed throughout the day with intense concentration. Eliza suspected he would be the son who inherited his father's head for business and planning. The neighboring families began treating the Brannigans differently as their success became apparent. Tom McCready sought Jed's advice on breeding decisions, and Sarah McCready started bringing her questions about difficult births to Eliza, recognizing her growing experience with frontier motherhood. "You're becoming the family others look up to," Pastor Reynolds mentioned after church one Sunday. "That's a responsibility as well as a blessing." Eliza nodded, understanding the weight of his words. As their family grew and prospered, they were becoming an example for other young couples, starting their own dynasties in the harsh but promising Wyoming territory. The third winter brought new challenges when Samuel came down with a fever that lasted for days, leaving Eliza sleepless with worry while she alternated between cooling cloths and herbal remedies. Jacob, barely walking but somehow sensing the crisis, stayed unusually quiet and well-behaved, as if he understood that his mother's attention needed to be elsewhere. "Children get sick," Martha reminded her during the worst night of Samuel's fever. It's part of growing up, especially out here where they're exposed to everything. The important thing is that he's strong and he's fighting it. When Samuel's fever finally broke, Eliza felt a profound gratitude that went beyond relief. Each crisis survived made the family stronger, more capable of weathering whatever storms lay ahead. The boys were developing the hardy constitution that frontier life demanded, but they were also learning the importance of caring for each other through difficult times. By spring, both boys were thriving. Samuel had grown into a sturdy 2-year-old with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's determined chin. Jacob, at 15 months, was taking his first steps and showing signs of the thoughtful intelligence that would serve him well in years to come. "Time to think about the next one," Jed said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel was playing with a set of wooden animals Jed had carved for him, while Jacob sat contentedly in Eliza's lap, studying the changing colors with fascination. Eliza nodded, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her still flat belly, where she suspected their third child was already growing. The signs were familiar now, the subtle changes in her body that had preceded both Samuel and Jacob's conceptions. "I think we might not have to wait long," she said softly. The family Bible would soon need another entry, and the carved cradle would rock another Brannigan baby to sleep. But as Eliza watched her 2 sons and thought about the life they were building together, she realized that the vow Jed had made on their wedding day had become less about numbers and more about legacy. They weren't just having 10 sons, they were raising 10 future men who would carry forward the values of hard work, family loyalty, and determination that had brought their parents together. Each birth was not just a step toward fulfilling a promise, but a commitment to nurturing the character and strength that would serve these boys throughout their lives. The Wyoming territory stretched endlessly around them, harsh and beautiful and full of opportunity for those brave enough to claim it. In their small cabin, surrounded by the everyday miracles of family life, Jed and Eliza Brannigan continued the patient work of building a dynasty, one child at a time, one day at a time, with love deeper than the mountain roots and determination stronger than the wind that never stopped blowing across their chosen land. The hand-forged horseshoes hung in neat rows along the workshop wall, each one shaped by Jed's hammer and tongs to fit perfectly the hooves of their growing string of horses. The rhythmic ring of metal on metal had become as much a part of the ranch's daily symphony as the lowing of cattle and the laughter of children, and Eliza often found herself timing her household tasks to the steady beat of her husband's work at the anvil. "Papa's making music," 3-year-old Samuel declared solemnly as he watched his father shape hot iron with practiced precision. At his feet, the twins, Ezra and Caleb, born just 6 months ago, lay on a thick blanket, their dark eyes tracking the shower of sparks that flew with each hammer blow. The twins had arrived together on a night when spring thunder rolled across the territory like cannon fire, announcing their entrance to the world with the drama befitting their status as the ranch's first multiple birth. Martha Wilson had been ready for one baby and found herself delivering 2, her experienced hands moving efficiently between the boys as they made their entrance just minutes apart. Ezra had been first, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his determination to lead in all things. Caleb followed quietly, as if he'd been studying his brother's technique and decided to improve upon it with a more dignified approach. Even now, at 6 months old, their personalities remained distinct, Ezra bold and demanding, Caleb thoughtful and observant. 4 sons, Jed had whispered that morning as dawn broke over the homestead, exhaustion and wonder warring in his voice. "We're a third of the way there already." The homestead had transformed almost beyond recognition to accommodate their growing family. The original cabin now served as the main house's kitchen and common room, with additional rooms built onto the back and sides until the structure resembled a small compound more than a simple frontier home. Each addition had been carefully planned and solidly built, designed to last through decades of Wyoming weather and the wear and tear of an active family. Jacob, now a sturdy 2-year-old, had appointed himself the twins' protector and entertainer. He would spend hours sitting beside their blanket, showing them his collection of smooth stones or singing the nonsense songs that seemed to fascinate babies everywhere. His serious nature had been tempered by genuine affection for his younger brothers, and Eliza often found him patting their backs when they fussed or bringing them toys he thought they might enjoy. The ranch operation had expanded to match the family's growth. Their cattle herd now numbered in the hundreds, managed by a crew of 4 full-time cowboys who lived in the bunkhouse Jed had built near the main barn. The horses had multiplied as well, with breeding stock that was becoming known throughout the territory for strength and intelligence. "You're becoming quite the businessman," Tom McCready observed one afternoon as he examined a young stallion Jed was considering selling. "5 years ago, you were just another bachelor trying to scratch a living out of hard ground. Now, you're running an operation that's the envy of half the territory. Got the right motivation?" Jed replied, his eyes finding Samuel as the boy attempted to lead a gentle mare around the corral with more enthusiasm than skill, building something for them to inherit. But success brought new challenges. The Brannigan Ranch's prosperity had attracted attention beyond their immediate neighbors, and not all of it was friendly. Eliza had begun noticing strangers riding through their area, men who claimed to be drifters or traveling salesmen, but whose eyes seemed more interested in counting cattle and measuring distances than in conducting any legitimate business. "Rustlers," Martha Wilson said bluntly when Eliza mentioned her concerns. "They always show up where there's something worth stealing. You and Jed need to be careful. Men with families to protect sometimes take risks they wouldn't consider if they only had themselves to worry about." The warning proved prescient when the McCready family lost 20 head of cattle to thieves who struck in the dark of the moon, leaving no trace except hoofprints leading toward the Badlands where tracking became impossible. Tom McCready's face was grim when he brought the news, and his usual jovial manner was nowhere to be seen. "They knew what they were doing," he reported to Jed and the other ranchers who gathered to discuss the threat. "Took the best breeding stock, left the rest alone. Professional job, not some drifters looking for quick cash." "What do you want to do about it?" Jed asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Form a protective association," Tom replied. "Take turns riding patrol, share information about suspicious characters. These thieves count on us being isolated and unprepared. Time to show them that's not the case anymore." The Ranchers Association became a regular part of their lives, with men taking turns riding the boundaries of their combined holdings and reporting back on anything unusual. Jed participated fully, despite Eliza's concerns about leaving her alone with 4 young children while potential dangers lurked in the territory. "I can handle things here," she assured him, though privately she wondered if that was entirely true. Samuel was old enough to follow simple instructions and even help with basic tasks, but Jacob was still prone to the wandering curiosity of a 2-year-old, and the twins required constant attention. The solution came from an unexpected source when Sarah McCready appeared one morning with her own young daughter and a proposal that made perfect sense once Eliza heard it. "We wives need our own association," Sarah announced, settling her baby beside the twins on their blanket. "Take turns staying with each other when the men are out on patrol. Share the work and the worry both." The women's arrangement proved as effective as their husbands' protective association. Eliza discovered that managing 4 children became much easier when she had help, and the other ranch wives brought their own skills and experience to share. Mary Foster was an expert at managing large household projects, while Ann Patterson knew remedies for childhood ailments that hadn't appeared in any medical text. "You're becoming the heart of something bigger than just your own family," Martha Wilson observed during one of her regular visits. She'd been watching Eliza coordinate the women's schedules with the same efficiency Jed brought to ranch management. "Leadership suits you." The observation surprised Eliza, who still sometimes felt like the uncertain widow who had married Jed Brannigan with more hope than confidence. But when she looked around at the organized chaos of her household, Samuel helping Jacob stack blocks while the twins napped peacefully nearby, she could see the truth in Martha's words. By autumn, the protective measures seemed to be working. No more cattle disappeared, and the suspicious strangers became less frequent visitors to their area. But the experience had taught valuable lessons about the responsibilities that came with success and the importance of community cooperation in frontier life. "We're not just building a ranch anymore," Jed said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Samuel and Jacob play in the yard while the twins slept in their mother's arms. "We're part of something bigger now, a community that looks out for each other." Eliza nodded, understanding that their family's growth had connected them to the wider world in ways they hadn't expected. The 10 sons they were raising wouldn't just inherit a ranch, they would inherit a place in a community of families who had chosen to build their futures together in the challenging but rewarding Wyoming territory. The hand-forged horseshoes represented more than just practical necessity now. Each one was shaped to fit perfectly, crafted with care and skill, designed to provide sure footing on uncertain ground. Like the family and community they were building, each piece was essential to the whole, and the strength of one contributed to the success of all. As winter approached, and the twins began showing signs of the robust health that characterized all the Brannigan boys, Eliza found herself thinking ahead to the children yet to come. 6 more sons to complete Jed's ambitious vow, but also 6 more members of a community that was growing stronger and more connected with each passing season. The forge would continue ringing with the music of creation, each strike of the hammer shaping not just iron, but the future they were all building together. The leather-bound journal lay open on Eliza's writing desk, its pages filled with her careful script, documenting the joys and sorrows of motherhood on the Wyoming frontier. Each pregnancy had earned its own section, each birth its detailed account, and each child his own collection of milestone observations, written in the quiet hours after the household had settled for the night. "Benjamin James Brannigan," she wrote by lamplight, her pen steady despite the exhaustion that seemed to live in her bones these days. "Born March 20, 1892, after a difficult labor that lasted 18 hours. Strong and healthy despite the struggle, with his father's broad shoulders and what I suspect will be his grandfather's stubborn streak. 5 sons now grace their home, ranging from Samuel at nearly 6 years old to baby Benjamin, barely 3 months. Between them were Jacob at 4, the twins Ezra and Caleb approaching 3, and baby David, whose entry she had not yet been able to write about, though he slept peacefully in the cradle beside her desk. David's birth 6 weeks ago had been preceded by a loss that still left Eliza's heart raw with grief. The baby between Benjamin and David had been lost at 5 months, a tiny life that had flickered briefly before departing as quietly as it had arrived. She'd carried that child through the harsh winter, feeling the gentle movements that promised another addition to their growing family, only to wake one February morning to silence and the terrible knowledge that something had gone wrong. "These things happen," Doc Henley had said gently after confirming what Eliza already knew. "Especially to women who've carried multiple children in quick succession. Your body needs time to recover between pregnancies." But Eliza's body seemed determined to fulfill Jed's vow, regardless of medical advice or personal cost. David had been conceived barely 2 months after the miscarriage, arriving healthy and strong despite his mother's fears that she might lose him too. 6 pregnancies in 7 years, Martha Wilson had observed with characteristic bluntness during her examination after David's birth. "Your body's strong, Eliza, but it's not made of iron. You need to rest between babies if you want to see all 10 of those sons grow to manhood." The warning had fallen on deaf ears, though not from stubbornness. Eliza found herself unable to deny Jed the intimacy that had produced 5 healthy sons, especially when she saw how tenderly he cared for each boy and how his face lit up with wonder at each new addition to their family. But the miscarriage had shaken something fundamental in her faith, not in God or in Jed, but in her own body's ability to carry every pregnancy to term. For the first time since their wedding day, the vow that had seemed like destiny began to feel like a burden too heavy to bear. "Tell me what you're thinking," Jed said softly, settling into the chair beside her writing desk. He'd been putting the older boys to bed, a nightly ritual that involved stories about ranch life and gentle reminders about morning chores. Eliza set down her pen and looked at her husband's weathered face, seeing the concern there, mixed with exhaustion that matched her own. Running a ranch that now employed 8 men while raising 5 young boys was taking its toll on both of them. "I'm thinking about the baby we lost," she admitted, "wondering if I should have done something different, rested more, worried less." "Doc Henley said there wasn't anything you could have done," Jed reminded her, reaching over to take her hand. "Some things are in God's hands, not ours." "I know." Eliza looked down at her journal, at the blank space where she should have written about the child they'd never held. "But it makes me afraid for the ones we haven't had yet. What if—" "Then we'll face whatever comes," Jed interrupted gently. "Together, like we always have." The household routine had evolved to accommodate their expanding family and the complex logistics of frontier life, with 5 young children. Samuel, now old enough to handle real responsibilities, helped with the morning chores and kept an eye on his younger brothers during the busy parts of the day. Jacob had appointed himself assistant to everything, following both parents around with eager questions and surprisingly helpful suggestions. The twins had developed distinct personalities, despite their identical appearance. Ezra was the adventurer, constantly escaping from the house to explore the ranch buildings and requiring frequent rescue from situations that tested both his courage and his parents' nerves. Caleb preferred quieter pursuits, content to sit with his mother while she worked or to help Samuel with the gentler ranch tasks. Benjamin and David, still babies, demanded the kind of constant attention that left Eliza feeling like she was always feeding, changing, or soothing someone. The nights were particularly challenging, with the babies' schedules rarely aligning and their older brothers occasionally waking from nightmares or childhood illnesses. "You're doing the work of 3 women," Sarah McCready observed during one of her visits, watching Eliza manage a fussy David while supervising the twins' attempts to help Jacob feed the chickens. "Don't know how you keep up with it all." The truth was that some days Eliza wasn't sure she was keeping up. The ranch house, despite multiple additions, felt crowded with 5 active boys and all the equipment their lives required. Clothes needed constant washing and mending, meals had to be prepared for an ever-growing household, and the endless cycle of childhood needs medical attention, education, discipline, and affection sometimes left her feeling overwhelmed. But there were moments of pure joy that made all the challenges worthwhile. Samuel's pride, when he successfully completed a difficult task, Jacob's serious explanations of how the world worked according to a 4-year-old's logic, the twins' infectious giggles when they discovered something amusing, and the peaceful contentment of nursing David while Benjamin slept in her arms. "Look what we've built," Jed said one evening as they stood on the porch, watching their sons play in the yard. Samuel was teaching the twins to throw a rope, while Jacob attempted to organize a game that involved rules only he understood. 5 strong, healthy boys who'll grow up to be good men. "5 down, 5 to go," Eliza replied, but the words carried less certainty than they had in earlier years. The ranch continued to prosper despite the demands of family life. Their cattle operation now supplied beef to mining camps and growing towns throughout the territory, and Jed's reputation for breeding quality horses had spread beyond Wyoming's borders. The financial success provided security for their expanding family, but it also brought increased responsibilities and the constant pressure to maintain their high standards. "You're becoming one of the most successful ranchers in the territory," Tom McCready said during a meeting of their protective association. "That makes you a target for people who'd rather steal success than earn it." The warning proved accurate when rustlers struck the Patterson Ranch, making off with 50 head of cattle in a night raid that showed careful planning and inside knowledge. The theft was bolder than anything they'd seen before, and it left all the ranchers feeling vulnerable despite their protective measures. "They're getting desperate," Jed observed grimly, "or more organized. Either way, we need to be more careful." The increased security concerns added another layer of worry to Eliza's already complex life. She found herself checking the locks more frequently and starting at unexpected sounds, especially when Jed was away on patrol duty. The older boys sensed the tension, and Samuel had begun asking questions about why Papa carried his rifle more often and why the cowboys always traveled in pairs now. As autumn arrived and David began showing signs of the robust health that characterized all the Brannigan boys, Eliza felt the familiar symptoms that told her another pregnancy had begun. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and trepidation, joy for the child growing within her, and fear that her body might betray her again, as it had with the baby they'd lost. "Number 7, she wrote in her journal that night, her hand resting on her still flat belly. "Please, God, let this one stay." The leather-bound journal held the complete record of their journey toward Jed's ambitious vow, the triumphs and the tragedy, the moments of perfect happiness and the times when the burden seemed too heavy to bear. Each entry was a testament to their determination to build something lasting in a harsh and unforgiving land, one child at a time, one day at a time, with love deeper than doubt and hope stronger than fear. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the changing leaves, carrying the promise of winter and the eternal cycle of seasons that marked the passage of time on the frontier. Inside their home, Eliza closed her journal and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new blessings in equal measure, as it always had since the day she'd married Jed Brannigan and embarked on the greatest adventure of her life. The surveyor's maps were spread across the kitchen table like accusations, their precise lines and official notations revealing secrets that the Brannigan family had lived above for 7 years without knowing. Joshua Michael Brannigan, their 7th son, slept peacefully in his mother's arms, unaware that his difficult birth 3 days ago had coincided with the arrival of news that would change everything about their family's future. "Silver," Jed said quietly, his finger tracing the mineral survey marks that covered their property like a rash. "According to these documents, we're sitting on one of the richest silver deposits in the territory." The maps had arrived with a stranger named Harrison Blackwood, who claimed to represent the Consolidated Mining Company of Denver and spoke with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He'd appeared at their door while Eliza was still recovering from Joshua's birth, his expensive suit and soft hands marking him as clearly as if he'd worn a sign declaring his urban origins. "These surveys were completed last month," Blackwood had explained, settling uninvited into their kitchen chair and spreading the papers with practiced efficiency. "Geological tests confirm substantial mineral deposits directly beneath your grazing land. My company is prepared to offer you fair compensation for mining rights." But Jed's background in engineering, a part of his past he'd rarely discussed, had given him the knowledge to read the technical notations that accompanied the survey marks. The deposit wasn't just substantial, it was potentially one of the largest silver finds in Wyoming territory, and the fair compensation Blackwood offered represented a fraction of the land's true mineral value. "You worked in mining before you came here," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. 7 years of marriage had taught her to read the subtle changes in her husband's expression, and she could see recognition in his eyes as he studied the geological reports. "Colorado," Jed admitted. Spent 3 years as a mining engineer before I decided I'd rather raise cattle than dig holes in the ground. Saw too many good men die in cave-ins and too many communities destroyed by mining fever. The revelation explained things Eliza had wondered about: his unusual knowledge of machinery and construction techniques, the precision with which he'd planned their ranch buildings, and the way he sometimes looked at the mountains as if he could see through the rock to what lay beneath. "That's why you chose ranching," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You knew what mining could do to a place, and what it could do to families," Jed confirmed grimly. "Mining companies come in like locusts, strip everything of value, and leave behind poisoned ground and broken communities. I wanted to build something permanent, something that would still be here for our sons' sons." But Blackwood's visit had revealed that their choice might not be entirely their own. The surveyor's maps showed mineral rights that predated their homestead claim, legal complications that could override their ownership of the surface land. The stranger had been polite but firm about the company's intentions to begin mining operations, whether the Brannigans cooperated or not. "These men you saw scouting the area," Martha Wilson said when she heard about the mining company's interest. "The ones you thought were rustlers, they were probably surveyors, mapping the deposits and planning their operations." The pieces began fitting together with disturbing clarity. The mysterious strangers, the increased interest in their property from supposed cattle buyers, even some of the more aggressive rustling attempts. All of it made sense if viewed through the lens of mining company competition for valuable territory. Samuel, now nearly 8 years old and possessed of his father's sharp intelligence, had been listening to the adults' conversations with growing concern. "Are they going to take our ranch, Papa?" he asked one evening as Jed tucked him into bed. "Not if I can help it," Jed promised. But Eliza could hear the uncertainty beneath his confident words. The older boys sensed the tension that had settled over their household like a storm cloud. Jacob appointed himself entertainment director, organizing elaborate games to keep the twins occupied while their parents dealt with increasingly frequent visits from men in expensive suits who spoke of mining rights and legal obligations. Even the babies seemed affected by the stress, with Joshua proving fussier than his brothers had been at the same age. "We could fight it in court," Tom McCready suggested during an emergency meeting of the Ranchers Association. "Pool our resources, hire lawyers from back east who understand mineral law. Courts favor mining companies." Bill Foster replied grimly, "They've got government connections, influence with territorial officials. Small ranchers don't stand much chance against that kind of power." But Jed's engineering background had given him insights that the other ranchers lacked. Studying the survey maps in detail, he'd identified weaknesses in the mining company's plans that suggested their legal position might not be as strong as they claimed. "These mineral rights surveys overlap with our homestead claims in ways that violate territorial law," he explained to the gathered men. "The original filings were done improperly, without adequate notice to existing landowners. We might have grounds for challenge if we can prove the surveys were conducted illegally." The revelation energized their resistance efforts, but it also escalated the conflict. Blackwood's subsequent visits became less polite and more threatening, with references to powerful friends in territorial government and reminders about the fate of ranchers who stood in the way of legitimate mining operations. "Your family's safety isn't something to gamble with," he said during his most recent visit, his eyes moving meaningfully over the household that now included 7 young boys. "Mining camps attract rough men, dangerous types, who don't always respect property boundaries or personal safety." The threat was clear enough to make Eliza's blood run cold, but it also strengthened her resolve. These men saw their family as an obstacle to be removed, rather than people with legitimate rights to the land they'd worked and improved for 7 years. "We're not leaving," she told Jed that night as they sat by Joshua's cradle, watching their newest son sleep peacefully. "This is our home, our children's inheritance. We'll fight for it." "Fighting might mean risking everything we've built," Jed warned. "These companies have resources we can't match, connections we don't have." "Then we'll find other resources," Eliza replied firmly. "Other connections. We're not the only family facing this threat, and we're not powerless." The next morning brought unexpected allies when Pastor Reynolds arrived with news that mining companies were targeting churches and schools throughout the territory, claiming mineral rights that would force entire communities to relocate. The religious and educational leaders were organizing their own resistance, with resources and connections that complemented the ranchers' practical knowledge. "This isn't just about individual properties anymore," the pastor explained. "It's about whether we're going to let outside interests destroy the communities we've spent years building." As word spread about the Brannigan family's situation, support arrived from unexpected quarters. Former military officers who'd settled in the territory offered tactical advice. Territorial officials who resented outside interference provided legal guidance, and even some miners who'd seen their own communities destroyed by careless extraction practices volunteered information about mining company weaknesses. "We're not just fighting for our ranch," Eliza realized as she watched the coalition of supporters grow. "We're fighting for the right of families like ours to build permanent homes in this territory." The surveyor's maps that had initially seemed like instruments of destruction were becoming tools of resistance. Jed's engineering knowledge allowed him to identify flaws in the mining company's plans, while the legal expertise of their new allies revealed procedural violations that could invalidate the mineral claims entirely. Joshua, growing stronger each day despite the chaos surrounding his birth, represented both the hope and the vulnerability that drove his parents' determination. 7 sons now depended on their ability to protect the family's future, with 3 more to come if they were to fulfill the vow that had started their journey together. The plot twist that began with silver deposits beneath their land had evolved into something larger, a test of whether families committed to building permanent communities could stand against corporate interests focused only on short-term profit. The outcome would determine not just the Brannigan family's future, but the kind of territory Wyoming would become as it moved towards statehood. The maps remained spread on their kitchen table, but they no longer looked like accusations. Instead, they had become evidence in a case that would define the rights of families to the land they'd claimed, improved, and defended against both natural and human threats. The battle for their home was about to begin in earnest. The Winchester rifle hung above the fireplace like a promise and a warning, its polished stock reflecting the lamplight, as Jed cleaned and loaded it for what felt like the 100th time in recent weeks. Nathan Peter Brannigan, their 8th son, lay sleeping in the cradle nearby, his peaceful breathing a stark contrast to the tension that had settled over their household like smoke from a distant fire. 3 months had passed since the mining company's legal challenges had begun in earnest, and the Brannigan Ranch had become the focal point of a territorial battle that would determine the rights of homesteaders against corporate interests. The older boys understood that something momentous was happening, though they couldn't grasp the full implications of the struggle consuming their parents' attention. "Papa's going to court again tomorrow," Samuel announced to his younger brothers as they sat around the kitchen table working on their lessons. At nearly 9 years old, he'd appointed himself interpreter of adult affairs for the rest of the family, to fight the bad men who want to dig holes in our land. "Why do they want to dig holes?" Jacob asked, his 6-year-old logic struggling with the concept of mining for profit rather than necessity. "Because there's silver under our pastures," Samuel explained, with the authority of someone who'd overheard many adult conversations. "But Papa says if they dig it up, it'll poison the grass and kill the cattle." The legal proceedings had indeed become the center of their lives, with Jed traveling to Cheyenne twice a month to meet with lawyers and testify before territorial officials. The coalition of ranchers, clergy, and community leaders had grown into a formidable opposition force, but the mining companies had responded with increased pressure and more sophisticated legal challenges. Eliza had taken on responsibilities she'd never imagined when she'd first married Jed 8 years ago. With her husband frequently away on legal business, she'd become the ranch's operational manager, coordinating with the cowboys, making decisions about cattle sales, and maintaining the complex network of community relationships that supported their resistance efforts. "You're holding this whole thing together," Martha Wilson observed during one of her visits. She'd been watching Eliza manage the household, coordinate legal strategy meetings, and care for 8 young boys with the efficiency of a military commander. "Jed's fighting the legal battle, but you're keeping everything else running." The observation was accurate but incomplete. Eliza had also become the emotional anchor for a community under siege. Other ranch wives looked to her for guidance and support. Their children played with her boys while their mothers attended strategy meetings, and her kitchen had become an unofficial headquarters for resistance planning. Aaron James Brannigan had been born into this atmosphere of controlled crisis 2 months ago, arriving with the robust health that characterized all his brothers, but also with an awareness that seemed unusual even for a Brannigan baby. At 2 months old, Aaron already showed signs of the alertness that would serve him well in a family that was rapidly learning the complexities of territorial politics. 9 sons, Jed had whispered as he held Aaron for the first time, exhaustion and wonder competing in his voice. 1 more to complete the vow. But the mathematical completion of their original promise had become less important than the preservation of their family's future. The mining companies weren't just threatening their land, they were challenging the entire concept of permanent settlement and community building that had drawn families like the Brannigans to Wyoming territory. The immediate crisis had crystallized when Consolidated Mining Company began bringing in equipment and personnel despite the ongoing legal challenges. Survey stakes appeared overnight throughout the territory, marking proposed mining sites that would destroy ranches, churches, and schools that had taken years to establish. "They're trying to create facts on the ground," explained James Morrison, the lawyer who'd traveled from Denver to represent the Homesteaders Coalition. "If they can establish mining operations before the legal challenges are resolved, they'll argue that shutting them down would cause greater economic harm than allowing them to continue." The strategy was cynical but effective, and it had prompted the homesteaders to consider more direct forms of resistance. The younger men talked openly about sabotage and confrontation, while the older ranchers counseled patience and faith in legal remedies that seemed increasingly inadequate. Jed found himself caught between his engineering knowledge, which told him exactly how to disable mining equipment, and his responsibilities as a family man who couldn't risk leaving his wife and 9 sons without protection. The Winchester above the fireplace represented that internal struggle, the tool that might be needed to defend what law couldn't protect. "Tell me what you're thinking," Eliza said one evening as they sat by the fire, Aaron nursing quietly while the older boys slept upstairs. The house felt different now, charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. "I'm thinking about our sons," Jed admitted, his eyes moving from baby Aaron to the ceiling where 7 other boys lay dreaming, "about what kind of territory they'll inherit if we lose this fight. And if we win, then they'll inherit something worth having," Jed replied. "Land that's truly theirs, communities built to last, the knowledge that their parents stood up for what was right." The next morning brought news that would force those abstract considerations into immediate action. Tom McCready arrived at dawn with word that mining company enforcers had occupied the Patterson Ranch during the night, claiming mineral rights superseded homestead claims and ordering the family to vacate within 24 hours. "They had papers," Tom reported grimly. "Official-looking documents with territorial seals. Bill Patterson's family is packing what they can carry and heading to his brother's place in Colorado." The forced eviction sent shockwaves through the ranching community and galvanized opposition in ways that months of legal maneuvering hadn't achieved. If the mining companies could seize one established ranch with impunity, no homesteader's property was safe. "This is it," Jed announced at the emergency meeting called for that afternoon. They've stopped pretending this is about legal procedures. It's about power now, and whether we're willing to defend what's ours. The Winchester rifle came down from its place above the fireplace that evening, cleaned and loaded and ready for whatever the morning might bring. But Jed also spent hours reviewing the engineering documents and geological surveys that had become their most effective weapons in the legal battle. "We're not just defending our ranch," he told Eliza as they made their final preparations. "We're defending the right of families to build permanent homes in this territory, without fear that outside interests can destroy everything they've worked for." Samuel and Jacob had been given specific responsibilities in case of emergency, protecting the younger boys, following predetermined evacuation routes, knowing where to find help if their parents couldn't provide it. The twins, now 5 years old, understood that something serious was happening, but remained confident that their parents could handle any challenge. The babies, Benjamin at 4 years old, David at 3, Joshua at 2, Nathan at 8 months, and Aaron at 2 months were too young to understand the crisis, but old enough to sense the tension that filled their household. They stayed closer to their parents, required more comfort, and seemed to sleep less soundly than usual. "Whatever happens," Eliza said as they stood together on the porch, looking out over the land they'd claimed and improved and defended for 8 years, "we'll face it as a family." The Winchester rifle rested easily in Jed's hands, its weight familiar from years of hunting and protection duties. But the weapon represented something different now, not just personal defense, but the willingness of a community to protect the civilization they'd built against forces that saw it only as an obstacle to profit. Dawn would bring the final test of whether homesteader families could stand against corporate power, whether the law would protect those who'd followed it faithfully, and whether the vow that had brought Jed and Eliza together would survive the greatest challenge they'd ever faced. 9 sons slept peacefully in the house behind them, trusting their parents to preserve the world they were growing up in. 1 more son remained to complete the promise that had started their journey together, but first they had to ensure there would still be a ranch for him to inherit when he arrived. The Winchester rifle gleamed in the moonlight, ready to defend not just a family, but the future they'd dared to dream of building in the harsh and beautiful Wyoming territory. The telegraph messages arrived at dawn, crackling with urgency across the wire lines that connected their remote ranch to the territorial capital. Eliza's hands shook as she read the official communications that would determine their family's fate, while Jed studied the engineering specifications he'd requested from former colleagues in Colorado. "Territorial Governor Harrison supports homesteader rights," she read aloud, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what the words meant. "Legal injunction granted against Consolidated Mining Company operations, pending final resolution of mineral rights disputes." The first victory had come through legal channels after all. But Jed's engineering expertise had provided the crucial evidence that tipped the balance. His detailed analysis of the mining company's geological surveys had revealed systematic falsification of mineral content data claims inflated to justify seizure of homestead land that contained only marginal silver deposits. They were running a fraud, he explained to the ranchers who'd gathered at dawn to hear the news. Taking good farmland based on false mineral claims, planning to strip what little silver there was and leave the territory with poisoned ground and destroyed communities. But legal victories in Cheyenne meant little if mining company enforcers refused to respect territorial authority. Word came by mid-morning that consolidated mining teams were ignoring the injunction and accelerating their operations, claiming federal mineral rights superseded territorial jurisdiction. "Federal marshals are 3 days away," Tom McCready reported grimly. "Company men know they've got that long to establish facts on the ground that'll be harder to reverse later." The confrontation Jed had hoped to avoid was approaching with the inexorability of a Wyoming blizzard. Samuel, now old enough to understand the gravity of their situation, helped organize his younger brothers while their parents prepared for what might come. Take the twins and the little ones to the root cellar if shooting starts, Jed instructed his eldest son. Jacob knows the way to McCready's ranch if you need to run. But running wasn't in Samuel's nature any more than it was in his father's. At nearly 9 years old, he'd inherited the Brannigan determination, along with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's fierce, protective instincts. "We're not leaving our home, Papa," he said with quiet certainty. "This is where we belong." The first direct confrontation came at noon, when a dozen armed men wearing consolidated mining badges rode up to the ranch buildings and demanded access to survey equipment they claimed was stored in the barn. Jed met them in the yard, the Winchester rifle cradled casually in his arms, but clearly ready for immediate use. "You boys are trespassing," he said calmly, his engineering background evident in the precise way he assessed their positioning and equipment. "Territorial injunction prohibits mining operations pending legal resolution. Federal authority supersedes territorial law," replied the lead enforcer, a hard-faced man with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "We're here on government business." "Show me the federal warrants," Jed demanded. And when the men couldn't produce proper documentation, he knew they were operating on bluff and corporate backing rather than legitimate legal authority. The standoff might have escalated into violence, except for the arrival of unexpected reinforcements. The Ranchers Association had coordinated their response, and within minutes, the Brannigan Ranch was surrounded by 24 armed homesteaders who'd ridden hard to support their neighbors. "Lot of federal agents for such a small operation," Tom McCready observed dryly, positioning his own rifle with the practiced ease of a man who'd fought in territorial Indian wars. "Seems like overkill for a routine survey." The mining company enforcers found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by men who knew the territory intimately and had everything to lose from corporate seizure of their land. After a tense hour of mutual threats and posturing, they withdrew to regroup and presumably request additional support. "First round to us," Bill Foster announced, but his satisfaction was tempered by realism about what would come next. "They'll be back with more men and heavier equipment." The victory celebration was brief and practical. Eliza coordinated with the other ranch wives to establish supply lines and communication networks that would support extended resistance if necessary. The older boys were assigned specific roles in monitoring approaches to the ranch and maintaining security for their younger brothers. But the most significant development came that afternoon when riders arrived from Cheyenne, carrying news that changed everything about their situation. The territorial legislature had passed emergency legislation recognizing homesteader rights over contested mineral claims, and federal authorities had agreed to honor territorial jurisdiction in exchange for guarantees about legitimate mining operations. "Your engineering report broke their case wide open," explained James Morrison, the lawyer who'd coordinated their legal defense. "When federal investigators confirmed the fraudulent survey data, Consolidated Mining lost all credibility with territorial authorities." The second telegram contained even better news. The territorial government had not only upheld their homestead rights, but had also imposed heavy fines on Consolidated Mining for fraudulent claims and illegal intimidation of legitimate settlers. The company would be banned from future operations in Wyoming territory. "It's over," Eliza breathed, hardly daring to believe that the months of tension and uncertainty had finally ended in complete victory. But Jed's engineer-trained caution wouldn't let him celebrate until they'd confirmed that mining company personnel had actually departed the territory. He organized patrols to verify the withdrawal and ensure that no equipment or personnel remained to cause future problems. The confirmation came at sunset, when the last of the mining company vehicles disappeared over the eastern horizon, carrying with them the threat that had consumed their lives for nearly 6 months. The Brannigan Ranch was secure, their community was intact, and the precedent established would protect other homesteader families from similar corporate predation. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table where surveyors' maps had once threatened their future, Eliza felt the familiar stirring within her that announced another pregnancy had begun. Michael Thomas Brannigan would be their 10th son, completing the vow that had seemed impossible 13 winters ago, when Jed had first taken her hands and made his extraordinary promise. The legal victory was complete, but its significance extended far beyond their individual family. They'd proven that homesteader communities could stand against corporate power when they worked together, that territorial law could protect those who followed it faithfully, and that families committed to building permanent homes could overcome even the most sophisticated threats to their future. Samuel helped put his younger brothers to bed that night, his childhood shortened by months of adult responsibilities, but his character strengthened by the knowledge that his family had stood for something important and won. The Winchester rifle returned to its place above the fireplace, no longer needed for defense, but kept ready as a reminder of what they'd been willing to risk for their children's inheritance. 9 sons slept peacefully in the house, with the 10th already growing in his mother's womb. The vow was nearly complete, the ranch was secure, and the community they'd helped build was stronger for having faced its greatest challenge and emerged victorious. The territorial charter arrived on a crisp October morning, carried by an official courier who'd ridden hard from Cheyenne to deliver the document that would secure their community's future permanently. The parchment bore the territorial seal and Governor Harrison's signature, officially recognizing Brannigan Valley as an incorporated township with full legal rights and protections under territorial law. Township status means no outside entity can challenge your collective land rights again, explained the courier, a young clerk who seemed impressed by the ranch's obvious prosperity. Your community now has the same legal standing as established towns like Laramie or Casper. Jed held the charter carefully. Understanding that the document represented more than legal protection, it was recognition that their community had evolved from a collection of individual homesteads into something permanent and significant. The mining company crisis had forced them to act collectively, and that unity had created political influence they could never have achieved separately. Brannigan Valley, Eliza repeated, testing the sound of their township's name. It felt strange to have their family name attached to something so much larger than their individual ranch, but it also felt right in ways she was still discovering. The charter had emerged from testimony Jed had provided during the final territorial hearings on mining rights and homesteader protections. His engineering background had given weight to his analysis of legitimate mineral claims versus fraudulent land grabs, and his detailed recommendations for preventing future corporate exploitation had impressed territorial officials enough to invite him to join the commission developing statehood preparations. "They want you in territorial government," Tom McCready said when he heard about the commission appointment. "Man who can outthink mining company lawyers and organize homesteaders into effective political action. That's the kind of leadership this territory needs as we move towards statehood." But Jed's focus remained on his family and community rather than territorial politics. Michael Thomas Brannigan was due to arrive within the month, completing the vow that had brought him and Eliza together 13 winters ago, and he wanted to be present for the birth that would fulfill their impossible promise. The ranch had become the unofficial center of Brannigan Valley Township, with the community school meeting in their largest barn and Sunday services held in the grove of cottonwoods. Jed had planted near the original cabin. What had begun as one family's ambitious dream had evolved into a thriving community of 24 families who looked to the Brannigans for leadership and stability. Samuel, now approaching his 10th birthday, had grown into the role of eldest son, with grace and competence that surprised even his parents. He could manage younger brothers, assist with ranch operations, and represent the family at community gatherings with the seriousness of someone much older. The crisis had matured him quickly, but it had also given him confidence in his ability to handle adult responsibilities. "He's ready to be a big brother to the 10th one," Eliza observed, as they watched Samuel organizing a game that included all his younger siblings while keeping them safely away from the area where cowboys were breaking horses. He understands what it means to be part of something larger than himself. Jacob, at 7, had become the family's diplomatic representative, equally comfortable with visiting dignitaries and neighboring children. His serious nature and careful attention to others' feelings made him a natural mediator when conflicts arose among the boys or within the broader community. The twins, Ezra and Caleb, had channeled their energy into different pursuits that reflected their distinct personalities. Ezra's adventurous nature made him an excellent scout and messenger for community activities, while Caleb's thoughtful approach to problems had earned him recognition as someone whose opinion was worth seeking despite his young age. Benjamin, David, Joshua, Nathan, and Aaron, the 5 younger boys, ranging from age 7 down to 10 months, represented the future of Brannigan Valley in ways their parents were only beginning to understand. They were growing up in a community that their family had helped create, surrounded by other children whose parents had chosen to build permanent homes in Wyoming territory. 10 sons, Martha Wilson said, as she examined Eliza during the final weeks of her pregnancy. When you married Jed Brannigan, did you ever imagine it would lead to this? The question required more thought than it might have years earlier. The shy widow who had accepted Jed's proposal had been focused on personal survival and the hope of having children. The woman preparing to give birth to their 10th son was the recognized matriarch of a township, a leader whose opinions carried weight in territorial politics, and the mother of boys, who would inherit not just a ranch, but a community built on the foundation of their parents' original vow. I imagined having children, Eliza replied carefully. I didn't imagine helping to build a civilization. But that's exactly what they'd done. Brannigan Valley now boasted a school, a church, a general store, and a network of mutual support that had proven its effectiveness during the mining company crisis. Other territories were sending delegations to study their model of community organization and cooperative defense against corporate exploitation. The final legal resolution came through official channels that validated everything they'd fought to achieve. Federal investigators had not only confirmed the fraudulent nature of Consolidated Mining's claims, but had also uncovered a systematic pattern of similar fraud throughout the Western Territories. The company faced federal prosecution, its officers were banned from future territorial operations, and new regulations would prevent similar schemes from threatening legitimate homesteaders. Your engineering analysis was the key that broke the whole thing open, James Morrison reported during his final visit as their legal representative. Federal prosecutors say it's the most comprehensive technical refutation of fraudulent mining claims they've ever seen. The victory had implications beyond their immediate community. Other homesteader groups throughout Wyoming territory had successfully challenged dubious mineral claims using techniques pioneered during the Brannigan Valley case, and territorial law now provided clear protections for families who'd established legitimate settlement communities. Michael's birth came on a cold November morning when frost painted the windows, and the older boys' breath made clouds as they did their morning chores. Martha Wilson had been staying with them for a week, her experienced presence providing comfort during the final stages of what would be Eliza's last pregnancy. Strong and healthy, Martha announced as Michael made his entrance with the robust cry that characterized all Brannigan babies. 10 pounds even, and lungs that'll serve him well if he decides to follow his father into territorial politics. Jed held his 10th son with the wonder that had accompanied each birth, but also with a profound sense of completion. The vow made 13 winters ago in a small frontier cabin had been fulfilled through years of love, loss, determination, and community building that had exceeded anything either parent had imagined possible. 10 sons, he said softly, his voice carrying satisfaction and amazement in equal measure. 13 winters, exactly as promised. But the numbers had become less important than what they represented. Each son was an individual with his own personality and potential. Each birth had strengthened their family and community, and the collective achievement represented something unprecedented in territorial history. The territorial charter that established Brannigan Valley as an official township would remain the most visible symbol of what they'd built together. The document guaranteed legal protection for their community while recognizing the precedent they'd established for cooperative homestead development and resistance to corporate exploitation. Samuel helped organize the celebration that brought together families from throughout their valley to welcome Michael and mark the completion of his parents' extraordinary vow. The gathered neighbors understood they were witnessing history, the fulfillment of a promise that had seemed impossible when it was made, but had become the foundation for an entire community's prosperity and security. The original cabin where Jed and Eliza had spent their first winter together now served as the township's administrative center, its simple rooms expanded and modified to accommodate the governmental functions of their incorporated community. The homestead deed that had once defined their individual property rights had evolved into the township charter that protected all their neighbors' futures. 10 sons, 13 winters, one impossible vow, fulfilled through determination, love, and the recognition that the greatest achievements require not just individual effort, but the support of communities built on shared values and mutual commitment to permanent settlement in a challenging but rewarding land. The family portrait sat in the place of honor on the mantelpiece, a formal photograph taken during Michael's first birthday celebration that captured all 12 members of the Brannigan family in their Sunday finest. 13 winters had passed since Jed's impossible vow, and the daguerreotype served as tangible proof that some dreams, no matter how ambitious, could indeed become reality through love, determination, and unwavering commitment. Eliza studied the image as she prepared breakfast for her family, still amazed by what they'd accomplished together. The woman in the photograph bore little resemblance to the uncertain widow who had married Jed Brannigan in a frost-bitten chapel so long ago. This woman stood with confidence beside her husband, surrounded by 10 sons whose faces reflected strength, intelligence, and the kind of character that could only be forged through growing up in a family that demanded excellence while providing unconditional love. Samuel, now nearly 11, had grown tall and broad-shouldered like his father, with the serious demeanor of someone who understood his responsibilities as the eldest. He could manage ranch operations when needed, lead his younger brothers through daily routines, and represent the family at community gatherings with dignity that impressed adults throughout Brannigan Valley. Jacob, approaching 9, had developed into the family diplomat, equally comfortable with visiting territorial officials and neighboring children. His thoughtful nature and genuine concern for others made him a natural leader in different ways than Samuel, and both parents could see that he would likely follow his father into the territorial politics that were becoming increasingly important as Wyoming moved toward statehood. The twins, Ezra and Caleb, had channeled their identical appearance into complementary roles that served the family and community well. Ezra's adventurous spirit made him an excellent messenger and scout, while Caleb's analytical mind had already shown aptitude for the business aspects of ranch management that were becoming more complex each year. Benjamin, David, Joshua, Nathan, Aaron, and baby Michael represented the future in ways that extended far beyond their individual family. They were growing up as citizens of Brannigan Valley, surrounded by other children whose parents had chosen to build permanent communities in Wyoming territory, inheriting not just land, but the social structures and civic traditions that would shape the region's development for generations to come. 10 sons, as promised, Jed said softly, joining Eliza at the window, where she stood watching their boys complete their morning chores with the efficiency of a well-trained team. But what we really built was something much larger than I imagined when I made that vow. The transformation of their individual family into the foundation for an entire community had surprised both parents, though perhaps it shouldn't have. The determination required to raise 10 sons in frontier conditions had naturally extended to protecting and nurturing the neighbors who shared their challenges and aspirations. Brannigan Valley now encompassed 37 families, with a proper school building, a church that served 3 denominations, and business establishments that provided most of the goods and services needed for civilized life. The territorial charter had protected them legally, but the real security came from the bonds of mutual support and shared commitment that held the community together through both prosperity and adversity. The mining company crisis had proven the effectiveness of their cooperative approach to frontier challenges. When outside interests had threatened individual homesteads, the community's coordinated response had not only preserved their land rights, but had also established legal precedents that protected homesteader families throughout Wyoming territory. "Other communities are copying what we built here," Martha Wilson observed during one of her regular visits. She'd been watching Michael take his first tentative steps while his older brothers cheered encouragement. Territorial officials say the Brannigan Valley model is being studied as far away as Montana and Colorado. The recognition was gratifying, but Jed and Eliza remained focused on the immediate challenges of raising their sons and maintaining their community's prosperity. Each boy was developing his own interests and aptitudes, requiring individual attention while contributing to the family's collective success. Samuel had shown particular aptitude for cattle breeding and ranch management, already handling responsibilities that would have challenged grown men in other circumstances. Jacob's diplomatic skills were increasingly valuable as the family's public profile grew, and community leadership demanded sophisticated understanding of territorial politics. The younger boys were developing their own specialties. Ezra had become the family's expert on local geography and weather patterns, while Caleb showed remarkable ability with numbers and business calculations. Benjamin's mechanical aptitude suggested he might follow his father's engineering interests, while David's way with horses indicated talent for breeding and training operations. Joshua, Nathan, Aaron, and Michael were still too young for specific predictions, but all showed signs of the intelligence, determination, and strong character that characterized their older brothers. They were growing up in a stable community with educational opportunities and social connections that would prepare them for whatever futures they chose to pursue. The vow was just the beginning, Eliza realized, as she watched her family work together with the precision that came from years of shared experience. What really mattered was the commitment behind the vow, the decision to build something permanent and valuable, regardless of how difficult it might be. The original homestead had expanded into a ranch operation that employed 23 full-time workers and served as the economic anchor for their entire community. Their cattle and horses were recognized throughout the territory for quality breeding, and their business practices provided models for other family operations seeking to establish similar success. But the most significant achievement was less tangible and more important than economic prosperity. They'd created a family culture that valued hard work, mutual support, education, and civic responsibility, while maintaining the individual freedom that had drawn them to Wyoming territory in the first place. The older boys were already talking about their own futures in ways that suggested they understood both the opportunities and responsibilities they were inheriting. Samuel spoke of expanding the ranch operations into neighboring valleys, while Jacob expressed interest in territorial law and eventual statehood politics. "We'll all stay close," Samuel had declared during a family dinner discussion about future plans. "This is our home, our land, our community. We'll build our own families here and raise our children the way Mama and Papa raised us." The sentiment was echoed by his younger brothers in various ways, suggesting that the Brannigan family's influence on their community would extend well beyond the current generation. The 10 sons would likely become the founders of their own dynasties, creating a network of related families that could provide leadership and stability for decades to come. As spring arrived and marked the 14th year since their wedding, Jed and Eliza found themselves preparing for new challenges and opportunities. Wyoming territory was moving rapidly towards statehood, and their community's success had brought them to the attention of officials who were seeking experienced leaders for the new state government. "The territorial governor wants to nominate you for the state senate," James Morrison reported during his latest visit. "Your work on mining law and homesteader protection has impressed people all the way to Washington." But political recognition, while flattering, remained secondary to family responsibilities and community obligations. The Brannigan family had found their place in Wyoming territory by building something permanent and valuable, and they intended to continue that work regardless of external opportunities or pressures. The family portrait captured a moment in time, but it also represented something timeless about the rewards that come from taking on impossible challenges with complete commitment. 13 winters ago, Jed's vow had seemed like romantic foolishness to the townspeople who witnessed their wedding. Now it stood as proof that the greatest achievements often begin with promises that seem too ambitious to keep. 10 sons, one thriving community, and a love story that had grown stronger through every challenge it faced. The impossible vow had become the foundation for everything they valued most. In the harsh and beautiful Wyoming territory, where dreams either died quickly or grew into legacies that lasted for generations, the Brannigan family had chosen to build something that would endure long after the last of their 13 winters had passed into memory.